Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unstoppable Podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I'm here today with our guest, Gabriel Anderson. He is a managing director at Tachyon, which is an accelerator. It's part of Consensus. It's an accelerator for early stage blockchain and Web3 startups. And I'm super excited to talk to him. He works closely with Sean Chain, who we just had on the podcast a few episodes ago at Consensus Mesh. And they were both also at Vayner together in the past. And so I'm really excited to have Gabe here. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Really excited to be talking with you and spending the next hour with you.
Awesome. So before we dive into Tachyon and everything that's going on over there, I want to know a little bit about your background. So obviously you were at VaynerMedia before this, and then I sort of like went even farther back and dug up your history a little bit more. It looks like you started your career in finance and then sort of got into marketing, and through it all, you were very much immersed in entrepreneurship. So tell me a little bit more about your background. Who were you before crypto, and then how did you get tugged into this crypto world?
I'll give you the fast version. Yes, super unconventional path, I think. So I've been an entrepreneur. I started my first company when I was 17. Started a webzine company called ocpartyscene.com. I was in college with two friends. We ended up getting acquired by a company called Lycos back in the days. I think Lycos ended up getting acquired by AOL or something like that. And but I always wanted to get into finance. Finance was kind of like my dream job. I grew up lower income family, and so the idea of breaking into the world of finance is really appealing to me. So I started my career, I guess, at a company called Merrill Lynch, institutional cash management. Climbed the ranks through that, but became really disillusioned. So, here I was 22 or 3 or something like that, and I had landed my dream job, and it wasn't at all what I wanted it to be. So I left finance, decided to go start what I would call like my real first company. I won't take you through the whole path, but it ended up being a failure. From that company, I started my second company, screwed up my cap table. That company ended up folding. Out of the ruins of that company, I started my third company, which got me into prop tech. That company was called Real Solutions Inc. I made the mistake of turning that company into a profitable business. It was we were doing 6 figures in profits. Every VC told me I was unbackable. I was hugely depressed. I couldn't raise any capital. I built our business model and our business in a way where I wasn't venture scalable. And so at that stage, I'd been working on building that company for a number of years, and I was just looking for something different. I was spending a lot of time in social media. This is the early days of like Twitter and Facebook, and I was really interested in what was happening, kind of like at the emergence of technology and some of these social platforms. Anyways, I followed this guy named Gary Vaynerchuk for a long time. And, Gary was building this company called VaynerMedia out in New York. And I cold emailed him, and I'd shown him a couple of things I had done in my startup career, and randomly just flew out to New York to meet with him. And decided to fold my company and go work with him for a couple of years. So I ended up at VaynerMedia. What I thought was going to be a 1-year stint ended up being 6 years with Gary. I started out in analytics. Then I built our growth engineering team. Gary was doing a lot of early stage investing back in those days. So I worked with a lot of our early stage companies back then. And then I kind of turned into EIR within Vayner's ecosystem. So I built our media publishing business back then called Vayner Publishing, which today has been gobbled up by a company within the Vayner X portfolio called The Gallery. I started our startup media business, which back then was called Vayner Beta, now called the Sasha Group. And so, after 6.5 years, kind of like at the front lines of growth marketing, growth engineering, and early stage tech in the New York scene, I kind of like done all the things that I wanted to do. I had also kind of played in the underbelly of like social media and marketing and growth. And I kind of knew I was the person who was manipulating people in social platforms, right? Like, so when I tell people like why I came to crypto, I came into crypto to wash away my sins. My hands are dirty. And so, I mean,
that's a new one. I haven't heard that one before.
It's very, very much my path. I was the person who was gobbling up all of the first party data that all these big platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest, et cetera, were using, and using that data to grow startups, grow large companies. And so, I was kind of getting tired of that. I knew how things worked. I was a little disillusioned about what I was doing. And my good friend Sean Chang had been at this company called Consensus for a number of years. He was the person that I kind of reached out to. And anytime I want to talk about like what was happening in this crypto space, I had a finance background back then. This was like 2017. So I'd already come across the Bitcoin Whitepaper and super excited about what was happening with Bitcoin. And then in 2017, all the ICOs were booming. And I was like really skeptical about what was happening in the ICO space. But Sean Chang was the person that I would reach out to and be like, hey, what's happening in this crypto world? And he just took me down the crypto rabbit hole. I mean, yeah, I was flying out to Toronto, and he gave me a couple of white papers to read. I think the Ocean Protocol was the first white paper I read. And I just, for an entire weekend, I could not stop going down the rabbit hole. Consensus was in the early days of, I think back then, we were incubating a lot of projects, MetaMask, Infura, Gitcoin, 3Box, Decrypt. And they were really looking for somebody to come in and really help these companies think about what does it look like to take some of the Web 2 best practices of like how to grow, go to market, all the things that I'd been doing previously in both my startups and in Web 2 tech. And so I made the leap when it came to Consensus. Started out, working with our early stage incubation companies before taking over Tachyon, which is our accelerator, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's a super unconventional path how I ended up in this ecosystem for sure.
I love it. I love it. I feel like honestly, like everybody has a pretty unconventional path ending up in this ecosystem because this is kind of like the Wild West right now. Still, 100%. Like what would be a conventional path of ending up here? There really isn't one that I can think
seriously.
of.
Yeah.
But okay, so you first read the Bitcoin white paper back in 2017. You heard about it. You were super skeptical of everything.
Yeah.
When was it that like a flip switched for you and you were like, okay, I get it. I'm buying into it.
I'd come across the Bitcoin white paper probably closer to 2016, and then 2017 I was really I was highly skeptical about what was happening in ICO in what was happening with the ICOs, and the thing that I was worried about was. I believed in, I was really excited about blockchain, the technology. I was really concerned that a speculative bubble would kind of burst, and that we would lose kind of like the really interesting aspects of more of like distributed ledger technologies. But it's when I started going down, when I started reading various white papers and starting to, read about different business models, and, I think reading, some of the early blog posts from Vitalik and kind of like some of the things that he was starting to talk about. I was reading about what was happening in prediction markets, and then a lot of people were talking about like Augur, and then, what you could do in like completely retooling insurance markets using prediction markets, for example. So I was always interested in trying to find those use cases that would actually touch real businesses or introduce new business models. And so, those were early days. There were, all those, early white papers that I was reading. It was still very highly experimental. But I could see the promise of this technology. And I think that, for me, I at the end of the technology, I'm always looking for the end user and the end market. And I could start to see that there are like real large markets that these technologies could actually touch, and real users and consumers, whether they're B2C, B2B, B2D, that could really start to open up new possibilities. And it got me really excited. And again, like I was in the underbelly of Web 2 tech. Like I knew what was happening, in terms of like how these platforms are utilizing first party data. I knew we needed a different model, a different system. So yeah.
Yeah. For sure. And nowadays it's, people who are getting into the space today are luckier in the sense that there's a lot more resources for them. So even if they don't have a Sean Chain to, onboard them onto Web3, they have maybe more resources out there. I'm curious, like, what are some of your favorite resources for learning that you've seen in the space today? It can be like blogs, books, podcasts, Twitter people, like anything.
Yeah. Oh my God. Like, yeah, I'm sure I'm going to miss a bunch of people. Like, I love what Cami Russo's been doing with Defiant. I think she, really made DeFi accessible. I love the Bankless team and crew and what they've been up to. I think just tons of smart people, on Twitter. I mean, the thing about this ecosystem that I'm always amazed with is just how smart everybody is. And just how open with information everybody is. I mean, there's there's no shortage of resources or things, in the Web3 ecosystem, in terms of like smart people. So, I mean, just looking at my Twitter feed, I think, I pick up a bunch of like really great resources and amazing people that I think are just doing amazing things. Yeah, podcasts like this, like, it's just, so much of this ecosystem is community driven, right? Like and there's so much sharing of information and knowledge, which I really love.
Yeah, 100%. Twitter is one of the
it's a fire hose.
My main ways of learning about the space. Like, I'm not gonna lie.
Seriously, yeah, it's a fire hose. It's great.
Yeah, for sure. All right, cool. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about Tachyon. I think everybody out there has heard of Consensus, but maybe not everybody has heard of Tachyon. So tell people a little bit more about what Tachyon is.
Sure, yeah. For those that are unfamiliar with Tachyon, so Tachyon it sits inside of the consensus mesh. We've collectively at this point incubated and invested in north of, at least the mesh, north of 100 projects and companies, some of the key pillars in the Ethereum ecosystem, right? So these are companies like Infura and MetaMask and 3box and Pegasus and Truffle and Gitcoin and Decrypt and so many more. Tachyon is our accelerator, and it's for the most ambitious early stage Web3 founders. And at this stage, we've launched 5 cohorts. We've been around since 2017. We've got over 70 active alumni, and we have the pleasure of working with just some phenomenal, Web3 startups that we met in the early days, and helped accelerate them. So companies like Nuo, Idle, Transact, Outlet, PiDAO, Multisafe, Parcel, Valis, so many more. Very simple. Tachyon, twice a year. So what we do is twice a year we bring together the most ambitious Web3 founders for an intense 12-week sprint to hone their value proposition. So we help them test their assumptions with real customers and prepare them for the next stage of investment and growth, which leads up to what's called a demo day, where we help them get ready for whether it's raising traditional VC capital for that next stage of investment and growth. A lot of our companies end up doing things like launching a token or opening up a DAO and building their community. But whatever that model is, it's really a 12-week sprint to really hone and test their business and get them ready for that next stage of growth.
Got it. So when companies come to Tachyon, what's the best stage for them to be at? Is it at like right past the ideation phase, or like should they have, some sort of like MVP out there, or like what's the best time to go to Tachyon?
Yeah, so most of the companies that we work with, at least the ones that we end up accepting into Tachyon, a lot of them come out of various hackathons. A lot of companies, a lot of projects started out at a hackathon. They've made multiple iterations. We over-index. I look for founders who are at the stage where they've got a working prototype, right? Like I want to look at some code, or I want to see an early version of a product. It doesn't have to be refined. It doesn't have to be very clear yet, but I want to know that you can build something, right? So a lot of the companies that we end up working with, a lot of them are like the ETH hackathon winners. They've made multiple iterations, kind of working on a proof of concept. I think that's kind of like the first filter. The second thing though, I think, just having been a founder myself and everybody on the team having been founders, we really over-index on the team. So aside from, you have to be able to build it. We're way past the days of like, getting accepted into Tachyon off of a white paper. In fact, there's only one company that I can think of in the last 2.5, 3 years that came to me with a technical architecture, and they had built a previous company before. And so we already knew that they were builders. And all they had was a technical architecture. But for most companies, once you get past that like build stage, you've got a working prototype. Then there's a couple of other filters that we start to look for. And for me, I really over-index on the team. Is this a team that has domain knowledge? Does the founder have a true north? Do they have grit and persistence? Do they have a bias towards action? Especially at that 0 to 1 early stage, I think the most important thing is the ability to push through and execute. Building a company is very fucking hard. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do. And so, I think those are the two main elements we really look for. It's you've got a working prototype, and we really over-index on the quality of the team.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of the project itself, do you have any sort of maybe in the back of your mind, subconsciously, you're looking for a certain type of project depending on what's hot in the space right now? Or do you really take on all crypto projects, whether it's DeFi, whether it's NFTs, all across the board?
Yeah, great question. So let me give you this cohort that we're in the middle of. We're about halfway through this program. They started in July, right? We are coming right up in this NFT hot season. But for us, we're trying to look forward to what the ecosystem looks like over the next 12 to 18 months. So if you look at the companies, we try to envision, what does Web3 look like over the next 12 to 18 months, not what's hot right now. So we have a lot of NFT companies in this cohort, but they're what I would call Gen 2, Gen 3 NFT use cases, right? So kind of past the aping into, digital assets, unique assets. And what does the next version of NFT look like? Whether that's, NFT converging with gaming platforms, or NFTs converging with DeFi platforms, or NFTs that are building portability across the metaverse, or NFTs that are really hacking on the programmability of these unique assets in terms of continuing on the user experience. So, we're very open. We work with DeFi companies. We work with enterprise and infra companies. I've got a couple of those in this current cohort. DeFi, NFT, gaming, metaverse, all the aspects that you would think of that are DAOs, treasury management type of tooling, things like that. All the things that are typically right now, but we look for what's right, what's next, what's the next version of what's coming in our ecosystem.
And so speaking of that, what do you see as what are the most important things that need to come next in order to, when we're thinking about ultimately achieving widespread adoption of crypto, what is the next thing that needs to happen? What's the next thing that needs to be built that hasn't been built yet that, we really need in order to reach that ultimate goal?
Yeah, I think so. What I'm really excited about right now is so two ways to answer that question. Maybe I think the first is crypto or Web3. It's still very hard to onboard into our ecosystem, right? So the UX is not quite there yet in terms of mass adoption. So my parents aren't in crypto. My friends who have real day jobs or whatever, it's hilarious telling what I do for a living, telling them what I do for a living, by the way. It's I work in magic internet money, and I work with early stage companies that are kind of building the frontier of future tech. They have no idea what's happening in this space. So, in terms of mass adoption, I think there's still a lot that we need to do in terms of abstracting away the complexity in terms of onboarding users into the ecosystem. But in terms of those of us that are already bought into Web3, I think there's some really interesting and exciting trends starting to take place. Obviously, we were just touching on a couple of them. I think what's happening within in terms of the convergence, the composability, and the convergence of NFTs, DeFi, metaverse and portability, ecosystem development, whether that's DAOs or DAO tooling, starting to see the convergence of these things start to happen, I think is the really, really interesting. It's the next level of composability, right? It's beyond composability. It's when these ecosystems now start to converge and you get these new combinatorial, connections that you would not have otherwise imagined. That's the next frontier right now. So aping into Bored Apes, that's cool. I love that. Don't get me wrong. I'm super fucking into it. But what happens when you start to hack NFTs in terms of their programmability, and think about, unlocking unique experiences in that full consumer journey, and what that looks like as a N equals one asset, digital native asset. And then what happens if you can create that value via a gaming mechanism, and then sell it on an open platform, or borrow against it as you hold it in your wallet, or stake it as you hold it in your wallet. Like this convergence is the thing that's starting to get me really excited right now. Yeah. So anyways,
I totally agree with that. It's like
Yeah.
NFTs on their own are super awesome. DAOs on their own are super awesome, but there's a limitation to what they can accomplish on their own. And if you think about all of these super awesome things joining forces, then the sky's the limit there. I'm curious to hear what are some of the coolest projects you've seen so far that have been able to combine different aspects of NFTs, DeFi, DAOs, different aspects of crypto into one. And then also if there's any use cases you can imagine, that haven't been built yet that you want to see somebody build. Maybe somebody's listening and they're like, I'm ready to build, just feed me an idea and I'll do it.
Yeah. So I'll try not to talk my book too much, because I think there's some amazing companies in this current cohort that are doing some really next level shit. In fact, I'll probably shout out a couple of them. But if I'm talking beyond Tachyon companies, who am I excited about right now? I love what the Avagachi team has been doing in terms of thinking through the convergence of DeFi and gaming. I'd probably actually put Axie Infinity in that same camp. In terms of thinking through what does it look like for play to earn, yielding true economic value. Using these DeFi protocols, but abstracting away having to be a yield farmer and just having the front end interface be kind of like a gaming mechanism. I think that's really, really cool and really exciting. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen around portability of NFTs outside of silos into the metaverse. I think Decentraland was kind of the first, real killer use case. And I think that's really interesting in terms of a platform play. But I want to start to see NFTs have real utility, and functions, and then be able to interact with other NFTs if we're really going to create this open and interactive metaverse ecosystem. So there's a company in our current cohort right now called 0x Essentials. I love what they're trying to do. The founder, there's a guy named Sam. He's got a bias towards action. He spins up proof of concepts all the time. He just launched a project called Wrestlers, which he's spinning up an NFT wrestling competition to try to see if we can create utility and function across these different NFT ecosystems, using a set of NFT standards to come into a metaverse type of environment. I love what they're doing. We've got a company in this current cohort called Nifty Royale that is building an NFT battle royale gaming platform as a way to increase distribution of unique one of kind NFTs and kind of a no loss gaming type of play. I think that's really exciting. I'm really interested to see what happens in terms of social tokens and social money and starting to unlock new value. Especially as the creator economy continues to boom and emerge. What are the new funding models that are going to happen with creators? How are they going to utilize whether it's their social money to unlock value for their key stakeholders or their followers, or how are they going to think about creating unique experiences using their social tokens, either turning them into NFTs themselves, or then refractionalizing them. And that's kind of been a really exciting and emerging trend that I've started to see happen in the ecosystem. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much happening in this space right now. It's a fucking flurry. I mean, it really is.
There's so much happening, and the thing that I love about it is that in what just based off of what you said so far, there were so many aspects of that. There's the technical challenges of how do we bring these NFTs and make them work in Decentraland across all the virtual lands and crypto voxels, instead of only having Decentraland NFTs or crypto voxels NFTs. There's a technical challenge of that. And then with things like governance and treasury management and things like that in DAOs. Like there's another challenge there. And then, there's like also this psychological challenge of like having to think about human psychology and human behavior and behavioral economics and like what motivates people, what incentivizes people. So that is one thing I really love about this space is I think, no matter where you come from, like you can come from you could be a historian, you could be a psychologist, you could be a coder. Like no matter what your background is, there is something really interesting and like a really interesting problem for you to solve in this space.
100%. Yeah. And I think, it's going to be, all these aspects of the ecosystem create kind of like this gravity swell to what you were just saying of like where really smart people with different, various domain knowledges can step in and start to figure out like, where am I going to participate? How am I going to participate? I think ultimately, what I love about the Web3 ecosystem more than anything is you find a lot more missionaries than mercenaries. People who really believe in trying to utilize this technology and create something really cool and really unique so that we don't go back and create like these individual silos like we did in Web 2, a Facebook silo, a YouTube silo, a Google silo, an Amazon silo. That's not what I want to see, right? I want to see a more open, fair, transparent, interoperable world.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so much opportunity too in this Web3 world for people to just pitch in and contribute their skills.
100%.
It's so different from the world that we grew up in where it's like you have to have all the credentials in order to, land your dream job at Merrill Lynch, which, was like looking back on that is pretty funny. Right. Yeah. And yeah, so land your dream job there. So that you can basically be a slave to somebody else and have them tell you exactly what to do and what not to do. Now it's sort of like you go into the ecosystem, you go into these DAOs and you identify the problem and you identify, like what your skill sets are that match up with that problem. And you just go and do it and solve it. And then you can get paid for that. And I think that's just a really exciting structure. And I think that's how we're really going to solve problems super fast.
Yeah, I agree. It's crazy. I was at this event here in New York. I think it was put on by Open Law, where a bunch of people from DAOs had showed up, and I was talking to a bunch of people who just recently aped into a number of these DAOs. And, you're just talking about like the human psychology behavior. Like the main driving thing here is one, there's a sense of agency, right? So I can kind of dictate, and create value, step in and create value where I see value that can be created. And then two, I get to participate in a portion of the upside of the value that I create. Like you don't have to overthink this, right? Like and this is the thing that I loved about, this reminds me of the early days of Web3, of what got me so excited is ultimately these are incentive and coordination problems that we are solving. And that's kind of like anytime I get lost in the sauce a little bit about like what we're doing, I always go back to the first principles. Like that's ultimately what I think we're trying to build around the Web3 ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you know Matt Stevenson. I had him on the podcast
No.
recently. He's a PhD behavioral economics person, and he's like has done so much research on like incentive problems. Yeah, I can connect you after this, but he's done so much research and thinking on like incentive coordination problems and what incentivizes people, they're like the social incentives versus the financial incentives and balancing that out. And I just think all of that is super fascinating. And
cool.
It's something, I think when people think about the space they still think of like a bunch of finance bros or like, coders and things like that. And there is such a bigger human component to it than most people have any idea that there is. And so I think that's super exciting. Something else I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned a lot earlier and, based on your background with startups and being in entrepreneurship basically your whole life, what are some Web 2 best practices for creating a startup that we can apply to Web 3?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked that question. Yeah. So it's funny, like when I first, Tachyon was sitting inside of the mesh. We'd run 2 cohorts before I took over. I took over in 2019 and rebuilt the business really from the ground up. Ultimately, the mission and vision of Tachyon is, we believe that Web3 will be synonymous with the internet in the next 10 years. And what we want to do is we want to find and accelerate and help support the future founders of that world. And so when I set out to redesign Tachyon, from the ground up, what we asked ourselves is, what does a native Web3 accelerator look like, and how do we 10x our impact? And so a lot of that was going back to first principles. First of all, Tachyon was built by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. We have been founders. We have been in the trenches. Our advice is not based on some theoretical bullshit or some blog or some theory. We are in the trenches with our founders, and we've been there. And so I think there's this tendency in with people who have not built companies previously, who are coming into Web3, to maybe want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think there's some really, really good first principles that you can borrow from Web 2 and then layer in the nuances of Web 3. So when I think about the best practices, the fundamentals of building a high growth startup, a venture backable startup, I think it starts with what we like to call the lockbox. And the lockbox for us is simply, you start with, some people call it problem solution fit, different than problem market fit, but it's, you start with identifying a problem, where a set of users or customers, there's something that they are trying to accomplish. And a good problem has both an insight and intensity. So what does that mean? You want to identify, what's the problem that your particular users have? Who has this problem? How often do they have the problem? How painful is it? What's your insight into your users or your customers, what they're trying to achieve, and how intense is that problem? I think once you hone in on a really good problem, the second key component is operating in a good market. So VCs will talk about how big is your market, the size of your market. And Web3 is not a big market right now. But I think there are really some key components to operating in a good market, which is, what's the size of that market? How fast is it growing? You can either get a small piece of a really big multi-billion-dollar, market. So DeFi is operating obviously, in, trillion-dollar marketplaces. And so while the DeFi ecosystem, its total TAM, total addressable market, might not be huge yet, it's racing towards a really big market. That's a big market, right? But the other way that you can go is you can try to get high penetration into a small but really fast growing. So the size of the market is changing really, really fast because there's some key shifts and trends that are driving growth. So DAOs, for example, right? 2 years ago, if you looked at the size of DAOs, and the size of treasuries within DAOs, for example, I don't know, a couple million. Now you're talking about orders of magnitude larger than that. That's a fast and large growing market. And then the third component to the lockbox, having a good problem, which has insight and intensity, a good market. And then the third thing is a differentiated solution. You operate in a marketplace. And so, do you have a unique advantage? Do you have a unique insight into the needs of your users and your customers and what their options are within the marketplace? Is it differentiated? Can you easily create value, for the market? And so I think, a lot of founders, especially when we come out of hackathons, we kind of fall in love with the technology. And especially if you're a founder who's kind of building for your own thing, right? The N=1 first business, that you bootstrap, that's fine to get you going. But the difference between a project and a startup is a customer, it's a user and a set of users. And so you ultimately go from building for yourself to building for other people. So I think those are really solid fundamentals in terms of going from 0 to 1. And then from there, it's the good old fundamentals of starting to demonstrate traction, improve demand. What does your go-to-market look like? And I think this is where you can start to get into some nuances around Web3 that are different and differentiated than, what I would call legacy tech. And I think that's really what separates Tachyon from a YC, for example. I think, while we respect, a Y Combinator and what they've done, I think, they've done what they've done in legacy tech world. And we're building a pure Web3 experience for what we think, an accelerator for what we think Web3 looks like. And so, as startups start going through proving demand and getting traction, because ultimately you're a high growth startup, you need to prove that demand. There's a whole playbook around how you should think about going to market, starting to think about your customer segments. Who are you serving? How are you serving them? What's your unique value proposition? What's that customer experience? Every startup competes on the same attack vectors, which are price, quality, delivery, and customization. And so you need to think about what your differentiated solution is in market. What's your channel strategy? Do you have intermediaries in them? What's your business model? What's your revenue model? And then as you start layering on the Web3 uniqueness, I think the two killer features of Web3 in terms of uniqueness in growing a high growth startup are composability and community. I have a blog post that's kind of like sitting in the draft that I need to get out the door at some point. But I think composability and community are probably the two strongest moats for Web3 companies, especially as they think about proving traction and going to market. And we spend a lot of time with our founders in thinking through those key elements as they begin to prove demand. But it kind of starts with the bedrock of like, what are the fundamentals of building high growth startups?
For sure. Yeah. I want to dive into both of those things because we are talking about Web3 startups here, and composability and community, I think are two of the things that a lot of people listening are thinking about. But one quick question when you think about like the total addressable market for, say like a consumer facing product in the Web3 ecosystem, are you looking at that as like people who are in the crypto space right now, or are you looking at that as like everybody? Because like you said, Web3 is going to be the internet in 10 years. And so in that sense, it's like the total addressable market is that everybody that's like using the internet today, or are you only looking at, people in the crypto space?
Yeah. So in the beginning, all startups need to get much more specific and much more niche, get small to get big. So I want to be able to see that you can level up into a very large market that's going to become a massive market, because that's how you're going to become a large business. But we can't start you there, right? Like I want you to tell me about a specific user, a specific customer, right? Like, Huddle01 in our last cohort had a specific user. They are building decentralized video conferencing solutions in emerging markets for users that are in the edtech space. That's a very specific user, right? So they're competing against Zoom, Google Meet. That's a huge TAM. Like I can see where that's going to go, but they're starting with edtech in the Southeast Asian marketplace. And so for every good startup, you want to start with your beachhead, your initial go-to-market, which is your serviceable, obtainable market, your SOM. It's usually a very specific set of users that you can build a solution around, who are going to be very excited and enthusiastic about the problem that you're solving for them. And then your objective is to create raving fans within your initial SOM, get high market penetration, and then level that up into your SAM, which is the serviceable obtainable market, a serviceable addressable market. And that's kind of like the next layer, right? So like if I'm looking at Huddle01, now they're going to move from edtech to freelance workers in the Southeast Asian marketplace, right? And so eventually they're going to level themselves up into a much larger ecosystem TAM, but you start really specific. You start really small with that initial addressable market, that beachhead. And it's very hard to do because we all have illusions of grandeur of like building these massive businesses. But if you can obsess about that the first 10 customers or the first 100 users are like they're the best for every startup. They are the best, and if you can obsess about those and build something that the first 100 people will love, I think you've got the beginnings of potentially a great company. So that's how I think about the TAM.
Yeah, that makes total sense. That makes total sense. So I want to talk about the composability and the community. So, I think those are two things that you probably should start thinking about from day one as well. Like even getting those first 100 users, you got to think about like, how do I get the most loyal and dedicated first 100 users? And a lot of that is, how you think about community building. So I'd love to hear your take on each of those things and best practices for building that, like how it's different, focusing on those things in Web3 versus Web2. Like obviously community is important in Web2 as well, but much more so in Web3 and maybe in a slightly different way.
Yeah, so I think the big difference is that, at least in my opinion, is so much about Web 2 is like I think about the early days of like Twitter and how they opened up their APIs, and then the Twitter slap came down on developers and they started taking away API access, because they went from building their community, open sourcing everything, and then everything became about value capture. And the difference between, I think, Web 2 and Web 3 is so much of our ecosystem was built around open source technology in the beginning, right? We're going back to, Web 1, the fundamentals of how the internet was originally built based off of protocols. And so composability is simply, figuring out ways that your product can fit in the stack. And what we've seen time and time again is that if early Web3 companies lean into composability, open sourcing, early versions of their product, trying to become composable, trying to become key pieces of the stack, that becomes a defensible moat. Because now they are an essential part of a larger and growing ecosystem. That's very much connected to the community building. And so a lot of our emphasis and focus with our early stage companies is building in public, like starting with, find the first 10 users or 10 customers, figure out what they want to have built, and build a community around them. So much of what our founders end up building will end up being community driven, where essentially your first customers are also your first couple of investors. They are they become incentivized to it's spread via word of mouth. It becomes so much of an exponential growth trend if you can start to hack that from the very beginning. And it naturally fits within the ethos of Web3 anyways. And so I think we really, anytime I have this conversation with, especially our venture partners, who are either not pure crypto venture, or they have an investment thesis around crypto, they're making kind of their entryway into crypto. They always ask me like, how are you thinking about what's this thing with composability? How are you thinking about value capture with your companies? And we kind of have to educate them a little bit. Composability and open source and building strong communities and opening up the technology it's a defensible moat in Web3, and that's the way you need to kind of think about it.
Yeah, 100%. And then with community too, there's, I'm in so many Discords, and some of the communities there are so much stronger than others. And it's all across the board. But I think it's like what would you, if you had to sort of, find the patterns and summarize it, what are the things that those strong communities are doing that the weaker communities are missing?
Man, it's the vibes, right? It's the culture. I think the really great communities. I think about like Peter Pan, now at 1KX, previously Metacartel, OG in the ecosystem, right? Like so much of the early days of like the Metacartel squad or the Raid Guild squad was just like, if even one person was excited about what was happening, like they brought that person into the fold, they nurtured that person, they brought them into the culture. We try to do the same thing with Tachyon. All of our founders, all of our alumni, all of our mentors and advisors, we want them to feel the vibes. We want them to feel like they are a part of something. We want them to feel nurtured. We want them to feel like, they are a part of something bigger than themselves. So much of the community is, there are the extrinsic motivations, right? So like when you join a DAO, when you join a community, there can be tokens, there can be financial incentives. Those are the extrinsic motivators. But I think so much more is the intrinsic motivation. I think we live in a day and an age where people want to be a part of something. They want to be connected to something, especially, coming out of this crazy, weird COVID world that we just came out of. not to get too philosophical here, but like we want to be connected. People need people. We want to be connected to one another. And so much of this, so much of this ecosystem can be about being connected with one another and being a part of something that's bigger than ourselves. And I think that's what people are looking for. I think that's why this is so exciting and such an exciting time right now within Web3.
Yeah, 100%. Do you recommend the companies that you work with at Tachyon, like if they don't already have a community manager, is that sort of a priority for them to get a community manager right off the bat? No?
No, I tell all of our founders, like, hand-to-hand combat. Until you are broken and you cannot engage with your community yourself, do not go out and hire a community manager. Like, understand who your community is. Do not try to outsource that. I think too many, especially technical founders, want to try to outsource that. I think that's a terrible idea. I'm active as the managing director. I'm active in our alumni Slack and our mentor and advisor Slack and in our Tachyon Discord channels. Until you cannot do it anymore, I think you should stay very, very, very connected to your community. It is that important. And if you are trying to build a community and it's just not happening, first go be a part of other people's communities. And go be a good participant and try to add value to other ecosystems and other communities, and people will get turned on to what you're doing and what you're building and what you're about. And they'll slowly start to join your Discord or your Telegram or your Slack. But yeah, I think it's a terrible idea for founders to try to outsource community management to somebody else in the beginning. Like, that's your community. They are there for you. They're there for your vibes. You set the precedence. You show them what the culture is within your community. Like, you should be in control of that.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and some might think that's a hot take. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Last question before we dive into your tweets.
Oh shit.
This part always gets people nervous. I'm not sure why. You tweeted it, like you should feel good about what you said, but
I stand by
it. Last question. Yeah. In your perfect world, like if everything progresses as planned, where will we be in 10 years with, I don't even want to say with crypto, because like Web3 is just going to be daily life,
Yeah, that's a great question. So I hope I can't even imagine it, right? Like, I think about, I think it was Walt Disney who said, I might be misquoting, but I believe it was Walt Disney who said, I don't know the futures, but it's bright and it's shiny and it's somewhere out there. Like, I fucking love that quote, right? And I live my life that way. I hope crypto and Web3 is that way. I hope it's just, I just hope it's bright and it's shiny and it's exciting and I get surprised and shocked by it positively in ways that I cannot even imagine right now. That's what I hope. I hope we're not all aping into speculative NFT. I hope we move past that part. And again, not to shit on anybody's NFT. I love all of your NFTs. I'll shill all of you. I love it. But like, I want to see what's next.
Yeah, for sure. I need to stop wasting time aping into all these NFT avatars and like do something legit.
I love it.
All right. Okay. So it's time for some tweets.
Oh, shit. All right.
Let's start with this one from April 7th, 2021. You said fractionalized NFTs being transacted with social money as access to community/personalities that transact on L2 rails is going to open up some of the most exciting new biz models civilization has ever seen. It's culture hacking 2.0. Okay, so there's like a ton of words here. I don't even know if people understood what I just said, but can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so this is what we were talking about earlier, which is this is kind of like an early thread or idea that I was thinking of like not just composability but convergence. So one of the reasons why I think NFTs became so hot is because it's what I call culture hacking. Right? It was accessible by mainstream. Mainstream for the first time could look at a crypto related project and say, oh, I know that. I know what that means. And it has to do with what's happening in culture. It has to do what's happening in the zeitgeist. And so as I start thinking about, the combinatorial convergence of things like social money and personalities now being able to tokenize themselves. And then as soon as, these layer 2 rails start coming that make transactions, the output of transactions much faster. And then you can start unlocking the value of these personalities that are attached to these, these tokens, via N=1 experiences through DeFi type of platforms. Like that becomes really, really interesting and really, really exciting as you start thinking about how creators are going to use that, how the creator economy is going to use those tools. As soon as you introduce new tool sets to creators, you get all kinds of really cool, amazing fucking things that come about. And so that's what I was trying to say is like, you can't even begin to imagine what that world is going to look like, but you're going to have all of these creators that are going to have access to these tools, that are going to figure out new ways of gaining access and value, not only to their communities, but where their communities gained access to them as well. And I think it's going to be really exciting.
For sure. Yeah. That I can't wait for all of that to happen and to see it just play out. All right. So this next tweet I've got, this is from July 13th, 2021. You said, just met a bunch of dope folks working for and excited about DAOs. No way traditional companies survive. Hot take. I didn't look in the comments, but did people come at you for this? And do you really believe that like DAOs are going to fully replace traditional companies in the future?
They will happen side by side for, I think, a very long time. But again, so much of legacy company organizations are hierarchical and they are top down. And what I think the magic of where I think DAOs really plays into is it's agency and it's upside. And abstracting away all the coordination components and making it very easy for people to come together and coordinate with one another, and having the incentive mechanisms that are layered on top, I think just creates the type of speed, the feedback loop, the cycle that becomes very, very hard to compete against. And I think you'll have some pretty fast-moving companies in legacy organizations that will figure out how to disrupt themselves and try to keep up at this pace. But I think you're going to see just a Cambrian explosion of DAOs and communities that can utilize these tool sets as they think about like both the coordination and the incentive mechanisms. I think that's really kind of the magic of DAOs right now.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a lot that legacy organizations can learn from DAOs on. And I think, if they can really learn from the DAOs and incorporate those practices into their systems, they can survive, and we can have,
But I'm bearish on that, because for most legacy organizations, it's not in their DNA. It just isn't. It's the innovator's dilemma, right? It's not in their DNA. And so I had a fantastic mentor back in the days who told me, Gabriel, there are two paths to enlightenment: the path of pleasure and the path of pain. Both will get you there. I think you're going to have a lot of legacy organizations that are going to go through the path of pain, and I just don't think they're going to be able to disrupt themselves.
Oh, you're right. I was trying to stay positive, but yeah. You're probably right. Okay, and then I've got one more tweet for you. This is from August 3rd, so just 2 days ago. You said, and this is non-crypto related, and this is really like a selfish one to pull out because I want to know how you resolve this. But you said, I just cleared out 3.5 weeks of email replies. If I was behind in getting back to you, I'm sorry. Doing the best I can. Need better systems. So I've got 250 unread emails, and my work one, and then my personal email is like hopeless. I've already given up on that. Did you find what's the solution? I need help with emails.
Diana, I have tried it all. Superhuman isn't it. Let me just tell you that I've tried that. Hotkeys isn't it. I've declared email bankruptcy 5 times in the last 6 years. I don't know I don't have a good answer for you. Like, between the emails, the Slacks, the Telegrams, the Discords, I'm getting murdered. I'm absolutely getting murdered. Like, somebody needs to figure. We actually have a company in this cohort called the Convo Space that I'm really excited about, that's building composable conversations in a decentralized manner. The main reason we invested in them is because I want the solution that he's building. But I don't know. I feel terrible that it took me that long to get back to people. If I owed you an email publicly here on the podcast, the Unstoppable podcast, I apologize. I'm doing the absolute best I can. I promise I will get back to you eventually. Thank you for your patience.
There you go, everybody. You've got a public apology from Gabriel on the Unstoppable podcast. Well, if you find a solution, definitely hit me up, because I think this is like the thing I'm worst at in my job is emails. And this is unfortunately a part of every job that you will ever have in life. So I feel like I need to figure out a solution to this. Yeah,
it's short of being able to clone ourselves. I don't know that we're going to have a great solution anytime soon, but I'll let you know if I find something.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time, Gabriel, to come on the podcast today. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally, and then where they can go to apply for the next cohort of Tachyon if somebody's got a great idea, or just learn more about it, or anything Tachyon's got planned coming up in the near future. Feel free to plug all of that.
Yeah, 100%. So, hit me up on Twitter, Gabriel Anderson, no N. I thought it was funny and cute back in the days, but now it seems like a terrible idea. But Gabriel Anderson, if you want to apply to Tachyon or learn more about Tachyon, you can find us at mesh.xyz/Tachyon, Tachyon. We've got demo day coming up with this cohort. You can go to mesh.xyz/Tachyon to find out more and sign up to get an invite to demo day. That's coming up September 17th. We'll probably be doing a closed door private invite investor day on September 10th, right before that. Or just send me an email. I just said
don't send him an email.
I know I just said I'm 3.5 weeks behind, but I promise you I will get back to you. It might be a while, but Gabriel.Anderson@mesh.xyz is how you can get a hold of me via email if you want to reach me that way too.
I feel like that's a bad idea just for anybody listening. Probably shoot him a DM.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Gabriel. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll be back again soon with another episode of the Unstoppable podcast.
Thanks, guys.